A man's voice, calm and steady, can make a billion-dollar company tremble. On a routine flight from Atlanta to San Francisco, a decorated pilot, citing protocol, orders a black man to leave the plane. The passenger complies without a word, stepping off the jet bridge and into the terminal. But he doesn't go home. Instead, he pulls out his phone. With a few quiet taps, he unleashes a corporate hurricane that the pilot, the crew, and the entire airline never saw coming. This isn't a story about an argument over a seat. It's a story about hidden power, quiet dignity, and the devastating, real-life karma that follows an act of casual prejudice. What you are about to hear is how one mon, pushed too far, grounded a multi-million-dollar jet and an entire airline's reputation from the palm of his hand. The hum of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was a familiar symphony to David Henderson. It was a cacophony of rolling suitcases, garbled announcements, and the anxious energy of thousands of people in transit. But for David, it was the sound of business. He wasn't just a traveler, he was a titan in the world this airport inhabited, though his appearance betrayed none of it. Dressed in a simple, well-worn pair of jeans, a dark grey polo shirt, and comfortable loafers, he could have been a teacher on vacation or an engineer heading to a conference. He preferred it that way. Anonymity was a luxury that wealth rarely afforded, but one he cultivated meticulously. He settled into his seat, 12A, in the premium economy cabin of Prestige Air Flight, PA 117, to San Francisco. It wasn't first class, but it had the legroom he needed for his 6'3" frame, and more importantly, it was unobtrusive. He placed his worn leather briefcase under the seat in front of him and pulled out his phone. The boarding process was still in full swing, the aisle clogged with passengers wrestling with overhead bins. His phone buzzed. It was a call from his chief legal counsel, Samuel Knight, in London. The connection was spotty, but the matter was urgent. "David, can you hear me?" Samuel's voice was tinny. "The deal with the German carrier is getting complicated. Their financing fell through, and they're asking for a 90-day extension on the lease payments for the 3 new A350s. David leaned his head against the cool plastic of the window, watching the ground crew scurry around the aircraft. "No extension, Sam," David said, his voice low but firm. "Our terms are clear. If their financing is unstable, they're a liability. We're not a bank. We're an asset manager. Let them know they have 48 hours to secure the funds, or we reallocate the aircraft. There's a waiting list for those birds." His company, Aerolease Global, was one of the largest private aircraft leasing firms in the world. Airlines didn't own most of their planes. They rented them from companies like David's. The Boeing 737 he was currently sitting on, there was a 70% chance it had his company's name on the ownership papers tucked away in a file in Dublin. David Henderson didn't just fly. He owned the sky. "Understood," Samuel replied. "I'll draw up the notice. I just wanted your final word before. Excuse me, sir." The voice was sharp, cutting through his conversation. David looked up. A flight attendant, a woman in her late 40s with tightly pinned blonde hair and a name tag that read Brenda, was looking down at him, her expression a mask of professional annoyance. "Sir, we're about to close the cabin doors. All phone calls need to be concluded." David glanced around. The doors were indeed still open, and several other passengers were still on their phones, speaking in hushed tones. He wasn't being loud. "Of course," David said politely. "Just wrapping up." "Sam, I'll call you when I land." He hung up and slipped the phone into his pocket. Brenda, however, didn't move. She lingered, her eyes fixed on him. It was a look he recognized, a subtle appraisal, a sizing up that had followed him his entire life, from scholarship interviews at MIT to boardrooms in Zurich. It was the look of someone trying to place him, to fit him into a box, and coming up with the wrong answer. A few minutes later, the main cabin door was sealed with a heavy thud. The captain's voice, smooth and authoritative, came over the intercom. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Robert Faulkner. Welcome aboard Prestige Air Flight 417 with service to San Francisco. Our flight time today will be approximately 4 hours and 50 minutes. Cabin crew, please prepare for departure." As the plane began its pushback from the gate, David felt his phone vibrate. A text from Samuel. "German carrier is protesting, claiming bad faith. Standard bluster." David typed a quick reply. "Hold firm. Follow protocol." He put the phone away. The jet taxied for what felt like an eternity, finally pausing in a long line of planes waiting for takeoff. The engines whined. It was during this pause that David noticed Captain Faulkner emerge from the cockpit and walk down the aisle, doing a final walkthrough. An unusual move for a pilot, but not unheard of. Faulkner was the picture of a classic pilot. Silvering hair at the temples, a crisp white shirt, and an air of unshakable command. He moved with an economy of motion, his eyes scanning the cabin. When his gaze landed on David, it stopped. He walked over. "Sir," Captain Faulkner said, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "I was informed by my crew that you were reluctant to end your phone call earlier." David was taken aback. "Reluctant?" "Not at all, Captain. Your flight attendant asked me to hang up, and I did so immediately." "She felt you were being dismissive," Faulkner countered. His eyes flicked down to David's casual attire and then back up to his face. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for non-compliance with crew instructions. It's a matter of federal aviation law." The accusation hung in the air, thick and unwarranted. David could feel the eyes of nearby passengers turning towards them. A quiet conversation had now become a public confrontation. "Captain," David said, keeping his voice perfectly level, "I assure you, I complied the moment I was asked. There seems to be a misunderstanding." Faulkner stared at him for a long moment, his jaw tight. It was clear he didn't believe him, or perhaps didn't want to. "See that it doesn't happen again," he said, before turning and striding back to the cockpit. David sat back in his seat, a slow burn of anger mixing with a familiar sense of weary resignation. It wasn't about a phone call. It was about something else entirely. It was about Captain Faulkner looking at him and seeing not a passenger, but a problem. He didn't know it yet, but Captain Robert Faulkner had just made the biggest mistake of his career. He had mistaken a giant for a mouse, and in doing so had set in motion a chain of events that would shatter his world. The giant, for his part, was simply waiting. He always followed protocol. The aircraft took off without further incident, climbing steeply into the Georgia sky. Below, the sprawling city of Atlanta shrank into a map of concrete and green. David tried to put the confrontation out of his mind, opening his briefcase to review a prospectus for a new fleet of long-range jets. He was a man who dealt in billions of dollars and decades-long contracts. A pilot's bruised ego was a triviality. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He could feel Brenda, the flight attendant, pointedly ignoring him during the beverage service, her movements stiff and her smile never reaching his brow. Another, younger flight attendant named Chloe Jensen seemed apologetic, offering him an extra packet of pretzels with a small, sympathetic glance. David simply nodded his thanks. He didn't want sympathy. He wanted the quiet, professional service he and every other passenger had paid for. An hour into the flight, turbulence hit. The plane shuddered and dropped, causing a few gasps in the cabin. The seatbelt sign pinged on, and Captain Faulkner's voice returned, this time with a strained, slightly irritated tone. "Folks, we're hitting some unexpected weather over the Mississippi Valley. We're going to try and climb above it, but it's going to be a bumpy ride for the next 30 to 40 minutes. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts securely fastened. Cabin crew, suspend service and take your seats." The turbulence was significant. The plane bucked and swayed, and the reassuring hum of the engines was joined by the creak of the fuselage. David, a seasoned flyer, was unperturbed. He continued to read his documents, his mind focused on engine efficiency ratings and maintenance schedules. It was then that a small child in the row behind him began to cry, a piercing, frightened wail. The mother's attempts to soothe the child were failing against the backdrop of the storm. Suddenly, the intercom crackled again. It was Faulkner. "Folks, I need to ask for absolute quiet in the cabin while we navigate this. We're in communication with air traffic control, and I need my co-pilot to be able to hear clearly." His voice was tight, stressed. "That means all conversations need to stop, and if you can, please keep your children calm." It was a strange, almost unprofessional announcement. While pilots needed to concentrate, the idea that a crying child in the cabin could interfere with cockpit communications was ludicrous. It spoke of a man on edge, his authority fraying. The mother behind David was now trying frantically to quiet her toddler, her hushing sounds filled with anxiety. David felt a pang of empathy for her. He remembered his own daughter's fear of flying when she was young. Without thinking, he turned slightly in his seat. He couldn't see the child, but he spoke softly in the direction of the mother. "It's all right," he said, his voice a calm baritone. "The plane is built for this. It's safer than being in a car." He was hoping to soothe the mother, knowing her calmness might transfer to the child. He never got to finish. Brenda, the flight attendant, was on her feet in an instant, her face a thunderous scowl. "Sir, the captain just instructed everyone to be quiet." Before David could respond, Captain Faulkner's voice blasted through the PA system, this time sharp and furious. "Who is talking in row 12? I gave a direct order for silence in this cabin." The public call-out was shocking. Every head turned towards David. He was now the focal point of the entire plane's anxiety and the pilot's anger. Brenda pointed a trembling finger at him. "It's him again, Captain. The man from before. He's ignoring your instructions." The accusation was a blatant lie, a malicious twisting of a simple act of kindness. But the pilot, already primed by his earlier prejudice, accepted it without question. A tense silence descended, broken only by the roar of the engines and the child's muffled sobs. For 10 minutes, the plane rocked through the turbulence. David sat perfectly still, his hands resting on his documents, his expression unreadable. He could feel the judgment of the other passengers, their glares burning into the side of his face. He was now the disruptive passenger, the troublemaker, the source of the pilot's rage. When the turbulence finally subsided, the calm was even more unnerving. The seatbelt sign switched off, and then Captain Faulkner emerged from the cockpit again. He wasn't doing a walk-through this time. He was marching down the aisle with a purpose, his face grim. He stopped directly in front of David's seat. 2 flight attendants, Brenda and Chloe, stood behind him. "Sir," Faulkner began, his voice dangerously low, "you have now, on 3 separate occasions, disregarded the instructions of my crew and myself. You were confrontational during boarding, and you deliberately disobeyed a direct order during a critical phase of flight." David slowly placed his papers into his briefcase and looked up at the pilot. "Captain," he said, his own voice still unnervingly calm, "every word of that is false. I complied with the phone call request, and I was attempting to comfort a frightened child and her mother." "I don't care what you thought you were doing," Faulkner snapped, his composure breaking. "You are a disruptive element on my aircraft. Your behavior is a potential safety risk. I am the pilot in command, and federal law grants me final authority on this vessel, and my authority says you are a threat." David stared at him, the full weight of the situation crashing down. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate, targeted act of power. "What are you saying, Captain?" David asked, his voice now cold as ice. "I'm saying that upon landing in San Francisco, you will be met by security. But that's not enough. I'm not flying for 3 more hours with a passenger I deem to be a security threat. We will be diverting." A wave of groans and murmurs rippled through the cabin. Diverting a flight was a major event, costing the airline hundreds of thousands of dollars and disrupting the plans of over 100 people. "However," Faulkner continued, raising his voice to be heard over the discontent, "we are close to Denver. I've spoken to operations. It will be a more efficient solution. Sir, upon our landing in Denver, you will deplane, voluntarily or otherwise." The humiliation was absolute. He was being publicly shamed, accused, and sentenced in front of a jury of his fellow passengers. He was being kicked off a flight, not for anything he had done, but for who Captain Faulkner perceived him to be. David Henderson held the pilot's gaze. He could have argued. He could have raised his voice, cited his rights, caused a scene that would have proven the pilot's twisted narrative. But that was not his way. Power, true power, didn't need to shout. Slowly, deliberately, he nodded. "As you wish, Captain," he said. He then turned his gaze to the window, watching the clouds drift by as if nothing had happened. Inside, however, a switch had been flipped. The situation was no longer about a flight. It was about a contract, and Captain Robert Faulkner, along with Prestige Air, had just breached it in the most spectacular way imaginable. The descent into Denver was tense and silent. The other passengers shot David looks ranging from pity to outright hostility. They saw a man who had forced them into an unscheduled stop, a troublemaker who had ruined their travel day. They had no idea they were witnessing the opening salvo of a corporate war. David remained impassive, his focus entirely inward. He wasn't angry anymore. Anger was a hot, inefficient emotion. What he felt now was a cold, crystalline clarity. He was a problem solver, a man who managed complex systems, and a significant problem had just presented itself. As the Boeing 737 touched down at Denver International Airport, it taxied to a remote gate far from the main terminals. This was standard procedure for security-related diversions. The jet bridge connected with a soft bump. Captain Faulkner's voice came over the intercom one last time, devoid of its earlier warmth. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for this unexpected stop in Denver. We are dealing with a security issue. We ask that you remain seated until the passenger has deplaned." A gate agent and 2 airport security officers, their faces stern and professional, appeared at the open door. "Mr. Henderson?" the gate agent asked, reading his name from a slip of paper. Without a word, David stood up, pulled his briefcase from under the seat, and walked down the aisle. He didn't look at Captain Faulkner, who stood with his arms crossed near the cockpit door, a smug look of victory on his face. He didn't look at Brenda, who watched him with undisguised contempt. He met the eyes of the younger flight attendant, Chloe, for a brief moment. He saw fear and regret in her expression, and he gave her a minuscule, almost imperceptible nod. He stepped onto the jet bridge, the airport security officers flanking him. The door to the aircraft hissed shut behind him. The humiliation was complete. He was now officially an outcast. The gate agent, a man named Paul, seemed uncomfortable. "Sir, if you'll come with me, we just need to file a report." "That's fine," David said calmly. First, can you tell me if my checked bag will be removed here? Yes, sir. They're already getting the order to pull it. Good, David said. He followed them into the empty terminal area. The security officers stood by, their job simply to ensure a peaceful transition. Seeing David's calm demeanor, they relaxed slightly. The airline has booked you on the next available flight to San Francisco, which is tomorrow morning at 6 a.m., Paul, the gate agent, explained, avoiding eye contact. They will provide a hotel and meal voucher. David almost smiled. The sheer inadequacy of the gesture was absurd. He pulled out his phone. That won't be necessary, he said. I'll be making my own arrangements. Paul shrugged. Okay, sir. We just need you to sign this form, acknowledging you've deplaned at the request of the pilot in command. David took the tablet and signed. With that, his formal connection to Prestige Air Flight 417 was severed. The security officers departed, and Paul pointed him towards the main terminal. You can head down to baggage claim for your bag. It should be at Carousel 10 in about 20 minutes. David thanked him and walked away, finding a quiet seating area with a clear view of the tarmac. He could see the plane, PA-417, sitting idle at the gate. The passengers were still on board, waiting. He watched as a baggage cart scurried over and his single, unassuming black suitcase was unloaded. He sat down, placed his briefcase on the seat next to him, and unlocked his phone. His fingers began to move with practiced speed. He wasn't calling a lawyer to sue for discrimination. Not yet. That was a blunt instrument. His tools were far more precise. First, he opened his secure email app and drafted a message to a single recipient. James Corbin, Head of Asset Management, Aerolease Global. The subject line was simple. Immediate action required, N1139PA. The body of the email was brief and laden with contractual jargon that would be incomprehensible to an outsider, but was a declaration of war to its recipient. James, confirming a material breach of the Master Lease Agreement, MLA, Section 14, Subsection C, Operational Misconduct and Brand Disparagement regarding asset N739PA, currently operating as Prestige Air Flight 417. The pilot in command, Captain Robert Faulkner, has engaged in conduct that jeopardizes the integrity of the asset and constitutes a willful disregard for passenger welfare, resulting in an unscheduled and financially detrimental flight diversion. I was the passenger, wrongfully removed. Execute Article 21. Lessor's right to immediate repossession on material breach. Issue a formal AOG, Aircraft on Ground, notification to Prestige Air Operations, effective immediately. Ground the asset at its current location, KDEN. Inform them that the Certificate of Airworthiness and Registration are hereby suspended pending our inspection. All access to the asset by Prestige Air personnel is revoked. Coordinate with our Denver-based field team. Have them on site within the hour to secure the aircraft. They are to take possession of all logs and documentation. This is not a negotiation. David. He hit send. Next, he sent a text message to Samuel Knight, his lawyer in London. Sam. Call me on the secure line. We have a situation with Prestige Air. A full portfolio review is in order. Finally, he opened another app, a proprietary fleet management system that showed the real-time status of all 800 of Aerolease Global's aircraft. He found N739PA. He navigated to the control screen and tapped a single digital button marked Initiate Contractual Hold. The status of the aircraft on his screen instantly changed from a green active to a flashing red AOG, Lessor Action. An automated alert was simultaneously fired off to Prestige Air's corporate headquarters, the FAA, and the Airport Authority in Denver. From his quiet seat in the terminal, David Henderson had just done the unthinkable. He hadn't just complained about his treatment. He had digitally repossessed the multi-million-dollar aircraft he had just been kicked off of. He looked out the window at flight PA 416. The ground crew, who had been preparing to push back, had suddenly stopped. A fuel truck that was approaching reversed course. The jet bridge, which had started to retract, slowly extended back to the plane. On board that plane, Captain Robert Faulkner was about to find out that the disruptive passenger he had removed was not just a man with a plane ticket. He was the man who owned the plane itself, and the flight to San Francisco was now indefinitely and very expensively cancelled. Aboard flight PA 417, confusion was quickly curdling into frustration. The passengers, who had initially been relieved by the removal of the problem, were now shifting restlessly in their seats. They had been on the ground in Denver for nearly 30 minutes. In the cockpit, Captain Faulkner was growing impatient. "Denver ground, this is Prestige 417, at gate C48, he radioed. "We've been ready for pushback for 10 minutes. What's the holdup?" The reply from the ground controller was flat and unhelpful. "Prestige 4117, stand by. We have a notification from your company's operations. You're on a ground hold." Faulkner frowned. "A ground hold?" He hadn't requested one. "Ground, can you clarify? That must be a mistake. We're ready to depart." "Sir, all I can tell you is that your dispatch has placed you on an indefinite hold. You'll need to contact them." Faulkner clicked off the radio, his irritation mounting. He turned to his first officer, a young, capable man named Mike. "Get dispatch on the A cars," he ordered, referring to the aircraft's digital messaging system. "Find out what the hell is going on. Probably some paperwork foul-up because of the diversion." Mike typed the message into the system. A few moments later, a reply printed out on a slip of paper. He read it, and his eyes went wide. "Captain, you need to see this." Faulkner snatched the paper. The message was terse and alarming. "Aircraft N739PA is AOG effective immediately by order of Lesser, Aerolease Global. Do not operate. Do not attempt to move aircraft. Awaiting instructions. All crew to remain on board." Faulkner stared at the message, his blood running cold. AOG, Aircraft on Ground. It was the most dreaded acronym in the airline industry. It meant the plane was broken, unsafe, or legally unfit to fly. But by order of Lessor, that made no sense. Lessors didn't ground planes for mechanical issues. The airline did. "Aerolease Global," Faulkner muttered, the name sounding vaguely familiar. He knew they were a major leasing company, but he had never heard of them intervening in an active flight. "This is insane. There must be a mistake. Get Jennifer Albright on the sat phone. Now." Jennifer Albright was the vice president of operations for Prestige Air, based in their Dallas headquarters. She was the one who had reluctantly approved his diversion to Denver. Meanwhile, back in the cabin, the passengers were getting louder. Brenda, the flight attendant, put on her most reassuring smile and walked the aisle. "We're just sorting out a small paperwork issue, folks. We should be on our way shortly." Her lie was unconvincing. Even the most inexperienced traveler could sense that this was not a small paperwork issue. In the terminal, David Henderson watched the scene unfold with the detached focus of a chess master observing the board. His phone buzzed. It was Samuel Knight. "David, what in God's name is happening?" Sam's voice was a mix of shock and dawning fury as David quickly recounted the events. "He did what? He put you off the plane? Because you tried to quiet a child?" "That was the pretext, Sam. You and I both know what it was really about." There was a moment of heavy silence on the line. "David, I am so sorry this happened to you. Save the apologies, Sam. We need to act. I've already grounded the asset. I need you to initiate a full portfolio review of our contract with Prestige Air. every single aircraft we lease to them. I want our legal team to go over the master lease agreement with a fine-toothed comb. Find every single technical default, every late payment, every minor maintenance discrepancy over the past 5 years. I want a complete picture of our exposure and our leverage. "You're thinking of pulling the whole fleet," Samuel said, his voice dropping. It wasn't a question. "I'm thinking that we have a clause about operational misconduct," David replied coolly. "And I'm thinking that the pilot in command of one of our assets, representing the airline, just created an international incident with the CEO of his primary lessor. If that's not a material breach reflecting systemic rot, I don't know what is. They put our multi-million-dollar asset at risk with a frivolous diversion, and they jeopardized our brand by association. We can't have our name on the side of planes flown by cowboys." "Understood," Samuel said. "I'll get the team on it immediately." "What about you?" "I'm in Denver. Our field team just arrived. I'm about to go say hello to my property," David said, watching as 2 black SUVs with the Aerolease Global logo pulled up on the tarmac near the stranded jet. Back in the cockpit of PA-417, the satellite phone rang. It was Jennifer Albright, and she was hysterical. "Bob, what did you do?" she shrieked, her voice so loud the first officer could hear every word. "Who did you kick off that plane?" Faulkner was stunned by her tone. "Jennifer, I removed a disruptive passenger, a man named David Henderson. He was a security risk. I followed protocol to the letter." "You followed protocol? Bob, you idiot! David Henderson is Aerolease Global. He's the founder and CEO. We lease 65% of our entire fleet from his company. That 737 you're sitting in, it's his, and he just took it back." The world seemed to tilt under Captain Faulkner's feet. The blood drained from his face. He looked out the cockpit window, and his eyes landed on the scene unfolding on the tarmac below. A tall, well-dressed black man was standing near the nose of the aircraft, speaking with a group of people in professional Aerolease Global jackets. They were holding tablets and clipboards, looking at the plane not as a vehicle, but as a piece of property to be catalogued. It was the man from seat 12A, the security risk, the man he had humiliated and ejected. David Henderson looked up, his eyes meeting Faulkner's through the cockpit window from 100 feet away. There was no anger in his expression. There was no triumph. There was only the cold, hard finality of a business transaction. In that moment, Captain Robert Faulkner understood. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had committed career suicide, and he had just pushed the first domino in a chain reaction that was about to bring his entire airline to its knees. The unraveling had just begun. The operations center at Prestige Air's Dallas headquarters was a state-of-the-art facility, a nerve center of screens, maps, and blinking lights tracking their 150 aircraft across the globe. But on this Tuesday afternoon, it was a war room on the brink of surrender. Jennifer Albright stood in the center of the room, her face pale, the phone still pressed to her ear. The call with Captain Faulkner had ended, but his stunned silence had been more damning than any confession. "Get me legal," she barked at a subordinate. "Get me the CFO. Get the CEO out of his board meeting. Tell him it's a code red." A code red was reserved for a crash or a hijacking. What was happening now felt somehow worse. It was a corporate decapitation, executed with the silent, digital precision of a drone strike. The first official email from Aerolease Global had already arrived. It was addressed to Prestige Air's CEO, William Bill Davies, and the entire executive board. It was a formal notification of the grounding of asset N739PA at KDEN, citing the material breach of the MLA. It was cold, professional, and utterly devastating. But it was the second email, which arrived 11 minutes later. that stopped everyone's heart. Subject: Notice of portfolio-wide default under master lease agreement. The email, sent from the desk of Samuel Knight, Aerolease Global's general counsel, was a masterpiece of legal destruction. It methodically listed a dozen other minor, previously overlooked technical defaults from the past 24 months, a maintenance report filed 3 days late on a flight to Dublin, a slightly delayed payment on an engine overhaul for a jet based in Frankfurt, a minor discrepancy in the insurance paperwork for a plane in Asia. Individually, they were trifles, the cost of doing business. But bundled together and triggered by the operational misconduct of Captain Faulkner, they painted a picture of a sloppy, unreliable partner. The email stated that due to the severity of the precipitating incident in Denver, which demonstrates a profound lack of institutional control and professional judgment, Aerolease Global had lost all confidence in Prestige Air's ability to operate their assets safely and responsibly. The final paragraph was the kill shot. Therefore, pursuant to Article 30 of the MLA, cross-default and acceleration, we are hereby placing your entire account in default. All 98 aircraft currently leased to Prestige Air by Aerolease Global are subject to immediate grounding and repossession at our sole discretion. We reserve the right to demand immediate return of all assets. A formal plan for this transition will be forwarded within 24 hours. Jennifer Albright felt the air leave her lungs. 98 aircraft. That wasn't just 65% of their fleet. It was their entire long-haul and premium domestic fleet. The newer, more fuel-efficient planes that flew their most profitable routes. Without those planes, Prestige Air was nothing but a struggling regional carrier with aging, inefficient jets. They would be bankrupt within a month. Bill Davies, the CEO, stormed into the operations center, his face flushed. "What is this? What in God's name is a portfolio-wide default?" "Bill," Jennifer said, her voice trembling slightly. "Bob Faulkner kicked a man off a flight in Denver. That man was David Henderson." Davies's face went from red to ashen gray. He knew the name. Every airline CEO knew the name David Henderson. He was a kingmaker and a kingbreaker in their industry. You didn't just lease planes from him. You entered into a partnership built on trust and brutal efficiency. "Get Henderson on the phone," Davies commanded. "He's not taking our calls," the chief legal officer said, walking up with his own phone. His office said all communication must now go through his legal counsel. The stock ticker on one of the large screens in the room suddenly caught Jennifer's eye. Their airline stock, which had been stable all day, had just taken a nosedive. The news wasn't public yet. This was high-frequency trading algorithms reacting to data they could scrape. The grounding of the flight in Denver, the filing of an AOG notice, the sudden flurry of communication between two massive corporations. The market could smell blood long before the headlines were written. Meanwhile, in Denver, the passengers of Flight 417 were finally being deplaned, not to another aircraft, but back into the terminal. The flight was cancelled. The crew, including a shell-shocked Captain Faulkner, were met by airline representatives. Faulkner was immediately relieved of duty and told a car was waiting to take him to a hotel where he was to await further instructions. He was a dead man walking. David Henderson had already left the airport. His private jet, a Gulfstream GA-50OR, owned and operated by a subsidiary of his own company, of course, was waiting at a private hangar. As he boarded, his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, but the area code was Dallas. He answered. "Mr. Henderson, this is Bill Davies, CEO of Prestige Air." Davies's voice was strained, attempting a collegial tone that fell completely flat. "I want to personally and profoundly apologize for the inexcusable behavior of my pilot today. It was a disgusting, unacceptable incident. And I assure you, Captain Faulkner's employment with us is already over." David listened, his expression unchanging. "Look, David," Davies continued, dropping the formality in a desperate plea. "We've been partners for 15 years. We can sort this out. This grounding, this notice of default. It's a death sentence. There has to be a way we can make this right." There was a long pause. David looked out the window of his jet at the setting sun over the Rocky Mountains. "Bill," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of a final judgment. "For 15 years, you've paid me for the use of my property. That's a transaction, not a partnership. A partnership requires respect. Today, your employee, acting as an agent of your company on my property, treated me as less than human. He didn't see a partner. He didn't see a CEO. He saw a black man he could push around." He let the words hang in the air. "This isn't about my feelings, Bill. This is about your institutional culture. If a 4-star captain feels empowered to act with such prejudice and impunity, what other risks are embedded in your organization? What other shortcuts are being taken? What other liabilities are you hiding? I've lost faith in your operation. My primary duty is to my company and my assets. I can't trust you with them anymore." "David, please." "The notice stands, Bill," David said, cutting him off. "My lawyers will be in touch with yours. Goodbye." He ended the call. The Gulfstream's engines began to spool up. The corporate cataclysm was now in full motion. It wasn't just one pilot's career that was over. An entire airline, built over decades, was about to be dismantled because its pilot couldn't see past the color of a man's skin. The karma wasn't just hitting back. It was a tidal wave. The fallout was faster and more brutal than anyone at Prestige Air could have imagined. Within 48 hours, the story broke. An anonymous source, later revealed to be the younger flight attendant, Chloe Jensen, who had filed a damning report through a whistleblower hotline, leaked the initial incident to a prominent aviation blog. From there, it exploded. Pilot's racial profiling of passenger grounds. Flight. Passenger turns out to be CEO who owns the plane. The headlines were a public relations nuke. Prestige Air's stock plummeted by 40% in a single day of trading, wiping out nearly $1 billion in shareholder value. The board of directors held an emergency meeting and, in a desperate act of self-preservation, fired CEO Bill Davies. It was a futile gesture. The damage was done. For Captain Robert Faulkner, the cascade of karma was a personal and complete annihilation. He was fired via a curt email before he even left his hotel room in Denver. The FAA immediately launched an investigation into his conduct, suspending his pilot's license indefinitely. The powerful pilots' union, which normally would have defended a senior captain, reviewed the evidence, including statements from Chloe and several passengers who corroborated David's version of events, and publicly announced they would not be supporting him. They couldn't afford to be associated with such blatant prejudice. Faulkner returned home to his pristine suburban house near Atlanta, a pariah. His name and face were everywhere. He was the poster child for corporate arrogance and racism. Neighbors who used to wave to him now hurried inside their homes. His wife, Patricia, a woman who had built her social standing on being a respected pilot's wife, was humiliated. The phone rang constantly with calls from reporters. His kids were taunted at school. "How could you be so stupid, Bob?" Patricia screamed at him one night, a week into the ordeal. They were drowning in legal fees and had just received a notice that their country club membership was under review. "You had everything. A perfect career, respect, a beautiful home. And you threw it all away because you couldn't stand being questioned by a black man?" "It wasn't like that," he insisted, his voice hollow. "He was being difficult. I had to maintain control." But even as he said the words, He knew they were a lie. He had been stressed from the turbulence. His authority felt challenged, and he had lashed out at the easiest target, a man he had subconsciously profiled and dismissed the moment he saw him. He had wielded his power like a club, and in return had been crushed by a power he couldn't even comprehend. Within 3 months, Patricia left him, taking the children. 6 months later, unable to find work, and with his reputation in tatters, he was forced to sell the house to cover his debts. Robert Faulkner, the proud, commanding pilot-in-command, ended up living in a small, rented apartment, driving for a rideshare service to make ends meet, forever haunted by the faces of passengers who would occasionally recognize him from the news. The airline fared no better. Aerolease Global didn't back down. Their legal team's audit had uncovered enough minor breaches to make their threat of a full repossession legally ironclad. They didn't take all 98 planes at once. Instead, they began a slow, agonizing process. As each plane came in for scheduled major maintenance, Aerolease would simply refuse to release it back into service, citing the default. Prestige Air's flight schedule became a chaotic mess of cancellations and delays. They were forced to wet lease aircraft from other carriers at exorbitant prices just to maintain their key routes. Their reputation for reliability was shattered. Passengers booked away in droves. Their competitors, sensing weakness, slashed prices on competing routes, bleeding Prestige Air dry. 9 months after the incident on Flight 417, Prestige Air filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. It was a stunning fall from grace for what had once been a premier American airline. The name Prestige Air became a business school case study on how a toxic internal culture could lead to corporate death. But amidst the destruction, there were seeds of positive change. Chloe Jensen, the flight attendant who had spoken up, was initially reprimanded by Prestige Air management for disloyalty. However, during the bankruptcy proceedings, her detailed, honest report became a key piece of evidence. After the airline's assets were auctioned off, she was personally sought out by a rival carrier, impressed by her integrity. They offered her a senior trainer position, responsible for developing new de-escalation and implicit bias training programs for cabin crews. She became a quiet force for change within the industry. David Henderson watched it all from a distance. He took no pleasure in the destruction of the airline or Faulkner's life. His actions had been defensive, a necessary response to a breach of contract and trust. His company seamlessly released the former Prestige airplanes to other, more stable airlines around the world. His business was stronger than ever. He did, however, make one final, quiet move. Through a philanthropic foundation his company ran, he established the Henderson Aviation Scholars Program, a multi-million-dollar fund dedicated to providing scholarships and mentorship for minority students pursuing careers as pilots, aerospace engineers, and aviation mechanics. He knew that the only way to truly fix the problem that had started in Seat 12A was not to punish one man, but to change the face of the entire industry, ensuring the cockpit of the future looked more like the diverse world it served. The karma cascade wasn't just about destruction. It was about clearing the ground for something better to be built in its place. 18 months after the fateful flight, the air in the boardroom was crisp and cool. David Henderson sat at the head of a gleaming mahogany table in Singapore, overlooking the city's bustling port. Across from him sat the executive team of a fast-growing Southeast Asian airline, their faces a mixture of excitement and reverence. They were there to finalize a landmark deal, a lease for 20 brand-new, state-of-the-art Boeing 787 Dreamliners from Aerolease Global. It was one of the biggest deals of the year. "Mr. Henderson," the airline's CEO began, "we are not just honored to be leasing your aircraft. We want to be a flagship partner for your new diversity initiative, the Henderson Aviation Scholars Program. It is visionary. We want the first 2 recipients to be from our country, and we will co-sponsor them." David smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "I would like that very much, Mr. Tan. A partnership is built on shared values, not just shared assets." The phrase hung in the air, a quiet echo of his last conversation with the CEO of Prestige Air. This was the result. This was the final reckoning. Not a bitter revenge, but a constructive new beginning. The capital, assets, and energy that were once tied up with a failing, toxic culture at Prestige Air were now being redeployed to fuel growth, opportunity, and positive change with a new partner. Later that evening, in his hotel suite, David was on a video call with Samuel Knight. "The deal is signed," David said. "They're all in, Sam. On the planes and the scholarship program." "That's wonderful news, David," Samuel replied. "It's good to see something so positive come out of that whole ugly affair." A notification popped up on Samuel's screen. He paused. "Speaking of which, you won't believe this. I just got a news alert. The last assets of Prestige Air were sold off today in bankruptcy court. The brand is officially defunct. An investment group bought their landing slots and logos for pennies on the dollar." David nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on his face. He felt no victory, only a profound sense of melancholy for the thousands of innocent employees, gate agents, mechanics, flight attendants who had lost their jobs because of a rot that started at the top. "Did you ever hear what happened to him?" David asked quietly. "The pilot." Samuel's expression softened. "I did, actually. A friend on the FAA board mentioned it. After losing his license, he tried a few things. Last anyone heard, he was working as a dispatcher for a small trucking company in Alabama. A complete fall from grace." David was silent for a long moment, picturing the man. Not the arrogant captain in the crisp uniform, but a broken man in a drab office, routing trucks on a computer screen. A man who once commanded a multi-million-dollar jet, brought low by his own prejudice. The karma had been absolute. It wasn't loud or explosive, but a slow, grinding erosion of everything the man had built his identity upon. It was the quiet, inevitable consequence of his actions. David's gaze drifted to the window, to the endless stream of aircraft lights blinking in the night sky over Singapore. Each one represented a complex system of technology, finance, and human trust. He had dedicated his life to that system. The incident with Captain Faulkner wasn't just an insult. It was a corruption of that system. His response had been to protect it, to excise the disease so the system could be healthier. He thought of the 2 new students who would become Henderson scholars. A young woman from a village outside Kuala Lumpur, a young man from a housing estate in Singapore. They would get a chance to command jets, just like the one he'd been kicked off of. They would sit in the captain's seat, not because of their privilege, but because of their merit. That was the final reckoning. It wasn't about the fall of Robert Faulkner or Prestige Air. It was about the rise of those who would follow, ensuring the sky was truly open to everyone. His quiet taps on his phone in that Denver airport had not just grounded a jet, they had cleared the runway for a new generation. This story serves as a powerful reminder that the person you dismissed today could hold the keys to your entire world tomorrow. It's about more than just a single moment of conflict. It's about the silent, invisible structures of power and the devastating consequences of prejudice. David Henderson didn't need to raise his voice. His power was written in the contracts that hold our modern world together. Captain Faulkner's mistake wasn't just being rude. It was his failure to see the humanity and the potential in the person in front of him. A failure that led to his own ruin and the collapse of an entire company. It's a chilling, real-world lesson in cause and effect. If this story resonated with you and you believe that dignity and respect should be non-negotiable, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more true stories about justice, karma, and the hidden forces that shape our lives. Click the notification bell so you never miss an update.